Welcome back to Earns and Means. I'm delighted to be joined again by Kianpour. He's my first returning guest, and I hope he'll return again. We're going to be talking about Connor's dissertation. We're just going to run through the entirety of it. His dissertation, without giving too much away, confronts the moral dilemmas faced by pro-life women, Black conservative, sexually conservative gay people, members of oppressed minority groups whose views fail to toe the ideological lines that are common within those groups. Connor, before we get into the philosophical meat of things, how was the process of doing your dissertation?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and also thanks for having me on again. I'm really delighted to be back as well. So the process of working on my dissertation. So when I was in the MA program at Georgia State University, I had already been very interested in dissident members of oppressed groups. I've always been super fascinated by people like Milo Yiannopoulos, Candace Owens, Andrew Sullivan, Shelby Steele, Thomas Sowell. And while I was in the MA program, I had a wonderful professor, Andrew I. Cohen, who encouraged me to tease out some of the philosophical questions that are relevant to thinking about the obligations that dissident members of oppressed groups have to each other. His encouragement led me to then writing 2 different papers on that topic, which are mostly free speech topics. Should you be allowed to engage in activism that is unpopular in the sense that other members of your group do not condone the activism that you engage in? So the first paper was this paper called The Minority Retort. The second paper is called The Political Speech Rights of the Tokenized, for anybody that's interested in those. And as I was working on those, I started becoming more broadly interested in the question of whether members of oppressed groups have special obligations to each other. I went into writing my dissertation with the view that they do not have special obligations to each other. I think for the most part, I was able to hold on to that view. But as I worked through the dissertation, I did notice that there were some sorts of concessions that I ended up having to make, but I don't see them as terribly threatening to the ethos that I was motivated to protect over the course of the dissertation. And I was fortunate enough to be at the university that I'm at with the dissertation advisor that I have, David Boonin, who has been so supportive of me pursuing this line of work, even though there isn't like a robust philosophical literature dealing with these issues, and I had to reconstruct a lot of positions that have been taken up by the popular culture over the course of the dissertation and then respond to those. But in terms of how the ideas that I've been exploring in my dissertation have been received as I've shared them with people at, say, academic conferences or something like that, I found it's been really interesting how people are very convinced that I'm wrong about the positions that I'm partial to, and they're very willing to attribute certain kinds of motives to me for wanting to focus on the issues that I'm interested in my dissertation. Nevertheless, I think that by having lots of discussions with people like that, I've been able to make my arguments reasonably strong. So that's how the dissertation came to life and how it's been going.
Yeah, so people are disagreeing with the views you're advancing in your dissertation about how members of minority. That's interesting. I mean, because I've only read 2/3 of it, but everything you've said is entirely convincing. I'm surprised that lots of people have disagreed.
I'm a bit surprised by that as well, mostly because it seems like nobody has given a sustained defense of the positions that I think are mistaken. And so you would think if people really, really disagreed with me, that there would have already been philosophical defenses of special obligations for members of oppressed groups that people have already produced and that the Academy would have been aware of. But to my mind, I've not seen such defenses. So I do think it's interesting that there's been as much resistance as I've faced over the course of this project.
One more question. Could you describe a bit more what it's like to have David Boonin as a dissertation supervisor? I mean, I once sent him a paper and he responded with maybe 7 pages of devastating criticism, and it was all good. I just can't imagine that happening to you every week.
Yeah, I mean, so David, I have nothing but good things to say about him. He's so wonderful. The way that he does philosophy, I think, is a model for how everybody should do philosophy. Such a clear thinker. And you're right, he's really amazing at just finding the vulnerability in an argument, pressing on it, and then making everything unravel. And obviously, there are some points where profiting from that gift of his could feel frustrating from my perspective. But every time I've ever responded to criticisms from him, my arguments have gotten better. So I would just consider myself blessed and lucky to be able to work with him. And I have nothing but good things to say about him.
Okay, so let's just launch in. You have a discussion of colorblindness, which I found really interesting. I want you to just kind of describe what you mean by colorblindness and what you also mean by its rival, color consciousness, because colorblindness is often strawmanned as the view that we should just ignore the implications of race in society and pretend that we can't see people's race. And then color consciousness is sometimes strawmanned as the approach where we're just hyperfixated to a pathological degree on race to the exclusion of character. How would you like to characterize those two words?
Yeah. So in the chapter that we're talking about, I take some time to explain the different kinds of accounts that somebody could give of the distinction between colorblindness and color consciousness. And the account of the distinction that I'm partial to is that a proponent of colorblindness thinks that what you are owed, morally speaking, and what you owe to others does not change depending on your social identity. So whether or not you're Black, white, man, woman, gay, straight, etc., what you are owed by others and what you owe others does not change. That's consistent with saying that in order to give people what they are owed, sometimes you have to take into account differences about them in order to give them what they're owed. So for instance, a female and a male are both entitled to, say, sufficient goods with respect to healthcare, but a female, because she's a female, might be entitled to access to sanitary products that males are not entitled to. So even though the difference in social identity makes a difference for how you give somebody what they're owed doesn't change. So that's colorblindness as I understand it. Now, color consciousness is just the converse of that, which is that what you are owed or what you do owe to others, morally speaking, can change depending on what your social identity is. So that's a very weak sort of claim that I think captures the ideas that a lot of proponents of color consciousness have. So some proponents of color consciousness, they think that it's okay to take race into account sometimes when determining what people are owed. Some proponents of color consciousness think that you must take race into account to determine what people are owed. And then sometimes there are cases in which you must take race into account and cases in which you may. So those are the two sorts of positions. And I'm inclined toward the view that even if we don't know which of these positions is true, we have strong reason to presume the truth of colorblindness over color consciousness.
Okay. And so just to like give that back to you to make sure I understand what you're saying, would you say that colorblindness is the view that one's social identity cannot in principle affect what somebody is owed?
The one sort of exception case that I would want to make sure that people are aware of, if we're going with that definition, would be cases in which somebody voluntarily makes their color something, the basis of which they could be owed something. So let's say that you made a bet with somebody about you're taking a 23andMe test and you're trying to find out what your genetic ancestry is. And you bet somebody that if you're Black, they owe you $20. So if it's the case that you find out that you're Black, you'll be owed $20 on that basis. But it's because you made your race or your social identity something which could be the basis for what people owe you or what you owe others, but not because you were born and what you are owed and what others owe you changes based on your social identity just because you have it.
Okay, yeah, because I was just, I'm glad you raised that, because I was just about to raise a much less intuitive example where you make a bet with a disembodied soul, and the bet is that if the soul conjoins with an African-American fetus, then you owe the fetus a large sum of money, but you don't if it inhabits a white fetus. So, like, by extension, could it be that somebody else's choice could affect whether or not you owe something to someone based on their race? So, if somebody has authority over the soul, say like God or the soul's parents, could they make a similar bet with you where you would owe the fetus money in virtue of the race that it has?
Yeah, I guess. Well, at that point, the obligation would not be an obligation that you have to the fetus. It would be an obligation that you have to the person that you made a bet about the identity of the fetus. So, yes, you could generate an obligation for yourself there, but it would not be an obligation to the fetus, and it would not be an obligation that is generated by the fetus's race to the fetus. It would be an obligation that you have to the parents because of a bet that you have regarding the fetus's identity.
Yeah, okay, that sounds right. I mean, this is a very important social issue. It happens a lot, but if we just put it to one side and consider some of the political cases, what's your argument that there's a kind of prima facie presumption in favor of colorblindness?
It's kind of a Pascal's wager style argument, where I call on people to consider the difference in cost between a scenario where color blindness is true, but we all acted as though color consciousness was, and a scenario where color consciousness is true, but we all act as though color blindness is. And so my claim is that in the world where color consciousness is true, but we act as though color blindness is true, that the costs to people in interactions where you're trying to determine what somebody is owed based on their social identity is going to be lower than the costs to people in the case where color blindness is true, but we act as though color consciousness is. So to spell that out just a little bit more. So let's focus on the case where color blindness is true, but we all act as though color consciousness is. So let's give this case of Eve and Denny. So Eve is a member of a marginalized social group of your choice. Denny is a member of, let's say, the dominant culture. Denny is trying to figure out if he owes Eve something on the basis of her social identity. And so if Denny acts as though he owes something to Eve, when in fact colorblindness is true, and Eve believes that colorblindness is true, you risk disrespecting Eve in the sense that you're infantilizing her. You're saying that you are owed something that other people are not, and it is my duty as your savior to basically supply you what you're owed. And moreover, Denny, if he was mistakenly led to believe that color consciousness is true, but in fact colorblindness is, he basically was deceived by the people who led him to believe that color consciousness was true into acting in ways that require him to take on greater burdens than he otherwise would have if he actually knew that colorblindness was true. So in that sort of case, we have Eve being potentially subject to disrespectful treatment, and we also have Denny having to shoulder the costs associated with having to act as though color consciousness is true. Now, in the alternative world, where color consciousness is true, but everybody acts as though color blindness is true, my contention is that the costs are way lower there, because Denny, if he's being deceived by others into believing that color blindness is false, he's being deceived into relinquishing burdens that he otherwise would have taken on, which is a benefit, not a harm to him. And Eve would still be at risk of being disrespected because Denny would not be able to supply her with what she's owed on the basis of her social identity. So given that the costs in these two scenarios are set up the way that they are, we should prefer the scenario where we assume color blindness, even if it turns out that color consciousness is true, given that the costs to everybody involved would be lower.
Yeah. So a few things jump to mind. You compared it to Pascal's wager. One difference between this wager and Pascal's wager is that Pascal's wager deals with infinite utilities, meaning that it doesn't matter what your credence is in, say, Christianity, because there's an infinite utility on the other side. So as long as it's non-zero, non-infinitesimal, your credence in Christianity can be just 1%, and you're forced to take the wager. By contrast, there are no infinite utilities at play here. There are finite utilities having to do with harms imposed on Denny and Eve, and by extension, members of in-groups and out-groups. And so it seems like if your credence to start out with in color consciousness is very high, saying 90%, then you probably shouldn't be moved by a wager argument like this, right? Because you think that the probability that you'll impose these extra harms, the harm to Eve that you'll infantilize her, and the harm to Denny that he'll take on extra burdens, you think that the probability that you'll actually inflict these harms is quite low. And so does the wager only work if you start out with a roughly 50-50 credence in colorblindness and color consciousness? And if you do have to start out with that 50-50 credence, don't you think that this argument will persuade precisely no one, because nobody coming to this debate is 50-50? They're coming to this debate either strongly in favor of color consciousness or strongly in favor of color blindness.
That's a really excellent question, and one that I have not heard yet. So I think it's possible that this wager will be effective to those whose credence is like 50-50 when it comes to color consciousness and color blindness, the truth of those doctrines. But I guess my suggestion would be, it's not clear to me that there are any independent reasons that people can give for why one is true rather than the other. such that they would be justified in having a credence higher than 50-50. And so in my paper, I consider some reasons that people have suggested could explain why we should presume the truth of color consciousness. And those reasons, I argue, don't stack up. And so if those reasons don't stack up, and it's not clear to me that there are any independent reasons to think that color blindness is true, we should be coming to this debate with a 50-50 mentality. And if we should be coming to this debate with a 50-50 mentality, then my conclusion should be true. But obviously, human psychology is flawed. So people might not be coming into the debate with a 50-50 mentality, in which case maybe my arguments wouldn't do work on them, but I'm wondering if that's not as much of a problem with my arguments as it is with their priors.
I agree that it's a problem with their priors and not with your argument. If you're right that people aren't justified in like initially assigning a higher than 50% credence in color consciousness. So just before we get to some of the arguments in favor of color consciousness, I want you to really sell me on the idea that if color blindness is true, but we act as if color consciousness is true, that will inflict great harms on both Denny and Eve, on both the members of the privileged group and the members of the oppressed group. So first, somebody might just say naively that like, well, look, Eve is going to be benefited in a whole bunch of ways if she's treated in a color conscious way. So like she might be given large reparations, for example. And even if this kind of signals an infantilizing attitude, it could be that like the amount of money that she's given is just going to outweigh that in terms of like the effects on her well-being. So like first, it could just be that the color conscious policies end up benefiting the person more than the infantilizing attitude. But second, like it's not clear that the attitude in question really is infantilizing, because the attitude in question comes from a place of say like racial justice, gender justice, and so on. And so the person in question cares about justice more than condescending or infantilizing Eve. And so it might not be that the color conscious policies are even expressing a condescending attitude at all, and so aren't harming Eve at all. She's getting a free ride and there's no harm.
So I think it matters to introduce like the distinction between acts for which people are blameworthy and acts for which people might be blameless. And it strikes me that even if somebody's genuinely believing that by giving Eve what they think she is due, they are not trying to communicate an infantilizing attitude, that might explain why they would be blameless for offering Eve help, right? And maybe would provide Eve with reason to not be an asshole to them just because they provided her with some kind of help that they think she needs. But I think it's worth nevertheless pointing out that even if people have really, really good intentions, that paternalistic modes of interaction can nevertheless really strike at somebody's self-esteem. And I think anybody who has even a good relationship with their parents can attest to that. Your parents might meddle in your lives in ways that, from their perspective, are completely innocuous. But the kid is most likely going to feel extremely frustrated and feel as though their claims are not taken seriously by their parents. And that if the kid were to ask, I want you to leave me alone, I want to figure this particular issue out on my own. But the parents nevertheless meddled, even if they thought they had a duty to meddle. It still seems like a significant harm hangs in the balance there. So intention, I think, does make a difference for whether we could call the people who act wrongly in the scenario that we're discussing blameworthy or blameless. But I don't think that it necessarily makes a difference for the kinds of harms that Eve is at risk of experiencing.
Mm-hmm. And so your other claim in that connection was that if colorblindness is true, but everyone acts as if color consciousness is true, members of the privileged groups who sort of act as if color consciousness is true are being harmed because too many requirements are being put on them that are too burdensome. I'm wondering what you make of this response. So we often think that virtuous actions are good for the people who perform them. So it might not be that your reason for performing a virtuous action is that it's good for you, but it just so happens that generally when you perform a virtuous action, it forms virtuous habits and dispositions and makes you a happier and better person. And that's plausibly a benefit to you. And so if you believe that you have this obligation to give, you have a false belief that you have an obligation to say, like, give money to members of oppressed groups, and then you act on that. Even though that belief is false, the action was still virtuous because you acted from the right place, from the right intentions. And so it's plausible that belief paired with your action is going to be good for you in the long run. Now, like, suppose we just knew counterfactually that Denny, the member of the privileged group, wouldn't be doing virtuous things if it were not for the fact that, like, they believe that they owed this specific duties to this specific minority group. It seems like the widespread, he'd just, like, stay home. He wouldn't do anything political. He'd just eat crisps. It seems like having this belief that he owes various duties to members of oppressed groups is actually going to be good for him, even if the belief is false. And so it's not clear that it does impose a harm on members of privileged groups.
Yeah, good. So a couple of thoughts come to mind. First, you have to take into account that even if somebody is encouraged to act virtuously, when they're being encouraged to act in a certain kind of way, that nevertheless, by encouraging them to act in that way, you're basically taking away opportunities that they have to act in different ways. And that includes ways that are more virtuous, right? So it could be the case that like Denny could be harmed because he's prevented from acting in a way that he otherwise would, that would be even more virtuous, which would be even better for him. And he's being precluded from doing the thing that would be better for him. And beyond that, I think it's important, like, this isn't like a direct sort of response to the concern that you raised, but I think that it's important to point out that under conditions where somebody believes that color consciousness is true only because they live in a society where people are basically encouraging them to think that it's true, you might think that they're actually not having virtuous motives when they act. It might be a virtue signaling or vanity-based thing that they're doing, where they want to do the thing that their society expects them to do so they can get the pat on the back. And that's paradigmatically not virtuous. Like, you should be motivated for the right reason, to the right extent, in the right circumstances. So that's another thing to bear in mind. And additionally, I think that just because virtue could be a good thing for people to experience, that there are things other than virtue that can be good things as well. And the deprivation of which could be bad for someone. So let's say that Denny was the type of person who's extremely artistic, and he would have, if he wasn't spending so much time trying to dedicate his life to causes of social justice because he thinks color consciousness is true, would have produced a lot of stunning art. Plausibly, there would be like aesthetic harms that we would have to account for as well. So like, even though virtue is good, other things are good too, is I guess the big point. And even if virtue is good, there might be things more virtuous than the kind of virtue that we might be getting Denny involved in. And also, Denny just might not be virtuous. He might be a virtue signaler. So that's like my three-pronged response.
Yeah, I think that's completely convincing. So we kind of agreed earlier that if somebody goes into your argument with a very high credence in color consciousness, then the argument shouldn't persuade them. And so what we need is a reason to think that you shouldn't go into the argument with a very high credence in color consciousness. So what are some arguments for color consciousness, and why do they suck?
So I guess I'll start first with what I call in the dissertation the remedial argument. So the remedial argument is based on this idea that there are these social patterns that have emerged in our society which disproportionately disadvantage certain groups of people on the basis of their social identities. And I think a lot of people agree with that sort of idea, which is why there's so much talk of like systemic racism, systemic homophobia, systemic sexism, etc. Those terms, I think, are trying to point out that there are these patterns that have taken a hold of our society. They disproportionately disadvantage certain groups of people on a basis that it's not clear that it's justified for them to be disadvantaged in that way. And so color consciousness would, people would think we should act as though it's true or believe that it's true because we could level out the playing field, so to speak. So if we live in a society where white people are disproportionately the ones that are in demand on the marriage and dating market, there might be some duties that are generated by a commitment to color consciousness for people to, I don't know, make a coordinated effort to date or potentially marry people who are not white, given that those groups of people are being disadvantaged relative to white people. So that would be like the remedial argument in defense of color consciousness.
So why don't you just respond to that one, and then we'll move on to something else.
Sure. So the first thing that I want to point out about the remedial argument is that it's really important to uphold the distinction between disadvantages that are wrongful and disadvantages that are lamentable but nevertheless not wrongful. So consider the case where Bruce asks Amy out on a date. Amy turns Bruce down. Bruce is harmed. The harm might be conceived of as a disadvantage, but we think that that harm is not like a morally significant harm because Amy was acting within her rights by refusing to go on a date with him, which was the source of his harm. So my contention is that the only kinds of social patterns that I think are morally objectionable are the ones that are produced by people acting wrongfully. And so in those cases where somebody isn't acting wrongfully and there is a social pattern that can't be explained by individuals acting wrongfully, there's nothing wrong about there being that kind of disadvantage in the world. But then alternatively, if it turns out that a particular social pattern can be explained by the wrongful actions of individuals who contribute to that social pattern, I would tell the proponent of color consciousness at that point, well, no, the people who have obligations are the people who acted wrongfully, not members of the group that those people belong to, right? So essentially the first objection that I have to the remedial argument is that taking the principles animating it seriously would lead us to indicting the actions of individuals and thinking of individuals as having obligations, not members of an entire social group. Okay, did that make sense?
Yeah, that did make sense.
Okay.
I want to take one more stab at criticizing this argument,
Yeah.
and then yeah, we can move on to some other issues because you had a lot to discuss, and it was really fascinating. So, the Pascal's wager argument, I take it, says like on the one side, if color consciousness is true, but we act as if colorblindness is true, there's one group of people who are harmed, namely like the members of the oppressed groups, because they're not given what they're owed. But the people who aren't giving them what they owed aren't harmed by that arrangement. And then on the other side, if colorblindness is true, but we act as if color consciousness is true, two groups are harmed because the members of the oppressed groups are being infantilized, and the members of the privileged groups are having to take excess burdens that they morally aren't required to discharge. And therefore we should wager in favor of colorblindness, absent a reason to wager in the other direction. Okay, so I think maybe you've undercounted the costs of the scenario in which color consciousness is true, but we act as if colorblindness is true. So my claim is both groups are actually harmed in this arrangement. Okay, so the members of the oppressed groups, as you say, they're harmed because they're not given what they're owed. But I think also members of the privileged groups who aren't giving the oppressed groups members of the oppressed groups what they're owed, they're also being harmed by that arrangement. And so, like, here's a thought experiment to draw that out. Imagine your ancestors stole like a grain, stole like a big bag of rice from a starving village, and you know your ancestor dies and gives this to you as a gift, and you take it everywhere. And then one day you take it on holiday to this village where everybody is starving, but you don't know they're starving, and you just like carry the bag around of stolen rice that really you owe to the village because they're starving and it's their rice. But you don't know that, nobody tells you. And so you spend all day just like walking around with this bag of rice, flaunting it in front of everybody, and nobody tells you that it's theirs and they should have it. So I think there's something kind of tragic about the situation from the perspective of somebody holding the bag of rice. They ought to be told that they owe the rice to the villagers. And part of the reason that they ought to be told that is because it's bad for them not to discharge the duties they have to these villagers, not to be able to give them what they're owed. And so that was a weird example, but like taking it back to the case where members of the privileged groups aren't in the know that they have to give, that they have to discharge various duties to members of the oppressed groups. Because they don't know that they have this obligation, but actually they do. They're being harmed because it's good for people to be able to fulfill their obligations, and bad for them if they fail to. So I think like there are two sets of harms on both sides, and it's hard to see which sets of harms is greater. If it's hard to see which sets of harms is greater, then the argument isn't going to work, and there's going to be no presumption in favor of colorblindness.
Yeah, excellent question. So I give the following sort of case, which I think is supposed to activate the intuition that you just tried to activate in my paper. So suppose that I have a gun and I think that it shoots rubber bullets, and everybody tells me that it shoots rubber bullets. And so my friend and I were messing around, and I'm like, I'm going to shoot you with this gun, thinking that it's just going to be a rubber bullet. Nothing bad's going to happen. I shoot the gun, turns out being a real bullet, and I kill my friend. So in a case like that, somebody might say, well, like, even if you're blameless for having done what you did, it still seems as though you are harming somebody in a way that you're being harmed in a way because you're the proximate cause of somebody else's distress or harm or wrongful treatment or something like that. So if that's the case, then it might be that Denny actually is significantly harmed under the specification of the case where color consciousness is true, but we act as though, no, color blindness is true, but we act as though color consciousness is true. So my response to that is that I've set up these cases of even Denny in like these two different worlds with it being stipulated what it is that Denny thinks, right? So Denny in one world believes that color blindness is true, and in another world, he believes that color consciousness is true. And so if Denny believes that color blindness is true, but color consciousness, in fact, is true, and he, sorry, hold on. I'm getting my thoughts mixed up. Sorry for the editing problems. So if Denny was going to be, so if Denny acts as though color blindness is true, but color consciousness is not, somebody might say, well, isn't it a harm to Denny to not be able to act the way that he ought to act? And I say, well, he believes that color blindness is true. So him not acting wrongfully, or him acting wrongfully, is not going to be distressing to him by his own lights. And if it's not distressing to him by his own lights, I maintain that he can't be significantly harmed. And the reason that I would be significantly harmed if I were to shoot a gun thinking that it would shoot a rubber bullet, but in fact it shoots a real one, that the reason that it's a significant harm to me is not because I ended up doing something wrong, but it's because I ended up doing something wrong, plus it was significantly distressing by my own lights. And so I would want to say that the reason we could say that there's a difference in these costs in the two cases is because we've stipulated Denny in such a way that he will never suffer the costs such that it would be distressing by his own lights to not act in accordance with what color consciousness demands of him because he believes color blindness is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so the reason in the rice and the villagers case that I said that the guy didn't know that the rice was from the villagers was because I wanted to elicit the intuition that even if the person doesn't know and never finds out that they're failing in their duties, it's still bad for them in some way. And so, like, to take the gun case, which is a much better case and much clearer, you can imagine just, you know, giving a real gun to a child, telling them it's a toy gun, and then telling them that every time they shoot it at a stranger, they're going to act as if they've been killed and fake blood is going to come out of their stomach, and everyone's just playing the game. And so you just push this kid out into the marketplace, and the kid starts shooting everyone. And a bunch of people die. It's very tragic. But the authorities decide that they're not going to tell the child that he's murdered a whole bunch of people. Why? Because it would be very distressing to the child, and the child doesn't have mens rea. And so the child just grows up thinking that they never did anything bad. Okay, I had the intuition that this was really bad for the child, that it was a detriment to their well-being in some sense. Maybe because it satisfied desires that the child has, or maybe because it violated, so it like forewent, or it like violated some good on the objective list. And so, like, if you have that intuition, then, like, assuming there's no good argument against that intuition, it's going to seem like it holds weight. And actually, even if you do a wrong thing that's not wrong by your own lights, and you never find out that it's wrong, that can still be bad for you.
Yeah, good. So, and I think it's possible for me to concede that it would be bad for you. But all I need to be able to say is that it would be significantly worse for you if you were to have knowledge of your wrongdoing, right? So Yeah, so I could hold on to the claim that there is some kind of harm in these cases, in the case of Denny and Eve, where Denny acts as though color consciousness, as though color blindness is true. But it seems to me like I could just say that, yes, that's a cost, but I would assign that cost like a value of 1. Whereas I would assign the cost of the missed opportunities that Denny would experience because he is sacrificing time and resources to act in a color conscious way when he could choose not to, that I would assign that a higher value in terms of how bad it is for him, in particular because it constrains his liberty in robust ways. And also, it's important to point out in the case that you gave of like the child, that the authorities like withheld information from later, that the child would be blameless, right? So even if they did something terrible, which makes it a bad thing for them, but they're also blameless for having done something terrible, which makes it significantly less bad for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so like, here's an argument for thinking that maybe like it really is quite bad to be like allowed to do a wrong thing, but even if you're blameless in doing it and like you never find out about it. So given that the topic of the dissertation is mainly about race, gender, and sexual orientation issues, we can like move it away from the gun case and bring it into a case more like that. So you can imagine that a foreign exchange student who doesn't speak a word of English comes to a college, and like some white students think it would be really funny to teach the foreign exchange student the N-word, but tell them that it means hello, and then send them into an all-black dormitory to shake everyone's hand and say what he thinks to be hello. And suppose that like the black dorm room is a pacifist dorm room, meaning that they won't harm the foreign exchange student, even though they're gravely offended by what he said. So like no adverse consequences will come of this. You know, I claim like that would be really bad for the student involved, right? With respect to their well-being, even if they never found out the meaning of what they said. And like, it's plausible that this is really bad, and it's not clear to me that it's somehow less bad than their liberty to say pursue an art project being constrained in some way is bad for them. In fact, it kind of seems to me to be worse. And if it's worse, then that would be a real problem for your argument, because then there'd be a presumption in favor of color consciousness.
Yeah, but couldn't the reason... I'm like inclined to think... No, that's a really, really interesting case. I'm trying to think if there's like something going on with an intuition that you have that might be able to be debunked.
Okay, yeah.
So like, I'm wondering if the reason that it might strike you as like especially bad for that person, if that state of affairs were to occur, I'm wondering if that has something to do with the kinds of social meanings that we've like attached to that, like obviously like the N-word, this and also like the sorts of ways that we hope to come across to other people, right? Yeah. Like I'm wondering if the sense in which you're pointing out something as being bad for them, it's like not so much that it's morally bad for them, but it's like bad because if they were perfectly informed, they would want to act a different way. And it seems like with the color blindness and color consciousness stuff, people would want to act in different ways if they were to be perfectly informed about the truth. of colorblindness and color consciousness. But the reason that they would want to act differently would not have so much to do with like social norms or personal shame or things like that. But it would have more so to do with like justice as such. And so I'm wondering if the reason that maybe you have the intuition in a case like that, that it could be worse for somebody, like for their own welfare, to be in a situation like that than to dedicate their time and resources to a cause that in fact they would not care about otherwise. Like, I think that the sort of scenario that I just said, like giving up time and resources, like the thing that makes that so bad on my account is how precious time and resources are for people to be able to pursue their own life projects. And it doesn't seem like knowledge of having done something wrong that you're blameless for is an impediment to your being able to pursue the life projects that you wish to, in the way that having literal expectations about giving up time would.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm tracking. So we'll move on to something else soon. I'll give you the last word on this issue. But like my initial thoughts is I'm not persuaded by this response. So, like you initially set it up as a debunking account. We're supposed to debunk the intuition that I have that the foreign exchange student would be seriously harmed by like saying the N-word to the Black dormitory. And the debunking account you gave to me just sounded like an explanation for why it might be the case that this is bad for him. Namely that like it frustrates this kind of counterfactual desire that he has, that like if he were fully informed, then he would not wish to offend everyone. And to me, that just sounds like a fairly plausible explanation of why he was in fact harmed, not a debunking account. So it doesn't say the intuition is wrong. It just gives a theoretical support for the intuition.
Yeah, but
and then a second point, just to give you something else to respond to, is that you made the point that like the reason why the foreign exchange student is harmed is different from the reason why the person who has their liberties restricted is harmed. And I think that might well be true, but I don't think it matters, because all I, as an opponent of your argument, need to show is that they're both harmed, not that they're harmed for the same reasons. And so, like, if we admit that people can be harmed for different reasons,
no, you wouldn't. You wouldn't have to show just that both would be harmed, but that both would be harmed, and we have reason enough to think that the harms are going to be as significant on both sides of the equation.
Yeah. Sorry, I agree with that. So I was thinking, like, if intuitively it seems like the harms are equally bad, but it turns out that the harms are explained for like different reasons. So like what one person was harmed because it went against like their desire to be polite, and the other person's harmed because it restricts their liberties. It could be true that they're harmed for different reasons, but if it intuitively it seems like when you kind of compare like cases for like cases, that the harms are roughly as bad, if not worse in the case of the foreign exchange student who says the N-word to the Black dormitory. Then,
I guess I'm inclined at that point then to like double down on the life project line that I was ending my what started off as a debunking sort of concern. It ended there. Because I would just appeal to the fact that somebody's ability to conduct their affairs in accordance with their conception of the good and to pursue their own life project, that value is like a much more important moral value than the other kinds of bads that you seem to be pointing out. And that I would say that because the bads in the case where I'm trying to say that colorblindness is less costly, if I could say that the life project stuff explains why the harms to Denny are significant harms, and then still hold on to the claim that there are harms to Denny in the color consciousness case, but just that those harms wouldn't count as the significant ones.
Right.
And I think my argument would nevertheless run.
Yeah. Sorry, I just had a mind blank. I'll cut this bit out too. I had a devastating response. I'm going to try and remember it.
No worries.
What was it? Yeah. Okay. So, my response to you is that we might explain both sets of harms: the one where you have your liberty restricted, and the one in which you're tricked into saying the N-word to a black dormitory, into it being a harm because it like frustrates your ability to live out your life's project. So the foreign exchange student might have as part of his life project that he isn't rude and disrespectful to people, and it might be so important to him that he cares more about not being rude to people than he does about pursuing his life project. So, you know, if it turned out that he had to be rude to someone in order to fulfill his life project, like he had to call a black person the N-word in order to succeed in the art world, he would decide not to do it because he cares more about not being rude than he does about his life project. And so if we can explain both harms in that way, then I think, and like I think that's fairly plausible. Then it will turn out that like actually the harms can be set side by side, and in fact, like it could be that for many people, they care more about not harming other people than they do about pursuing their, say, artistic careers.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, so it seems like you're trying to say that there's like an integrity concern that might crop up. Yeah, that's fascinating. And honestly, at this point, all I can really say is that I feel like I need to give that a little bit more thought.
Fair enough.
But I guess I also do want to reemphasize that this difference between Denny relinquishing burdens and Denny taking on burdens that otherwise he wouldn't.
Yeah.
I think that distinction is really meaningful and there is a lot of intuitive bite to the thought that having to take on burdens is more burdensome than having to relinquish burdens, especially if the burdens that you relinquish, if there's some wrongdoing implicated in your relinquishing those burdens, if you're blameless for it, like, I do think that does make a difference. Maybe there's just like a difference in intuition going on here. I really hope that's not the case because I'd like to bring you into my fold at some point. But I did want to point out that I do think the relinquishing and taking on burdens distinction does do a lot of work. And I think that if people want to make trouble for my argument, that in addition to bringing up these sorts of values, such as integrity that you're talking about, that I think you would have to also give an explanation for why the taking on burdens is not so much worse than having to relinquish them.
Yeah. I mean, so like, as far as, you know, how we're going to settle the question of which is worse, I think it's going to come down to hypotheticals where we kind of compare what we would want or what a benevolent third party, would want for us. So I don't know. I can imagine a case where I'm kind of presented with kind of two lives that I can envisage for myself, and I can only choose one of these lives. So one life is one in which I have to spend an hour less every day pursuing my dreams. So an hour less every day pursuing my artistic career, and you know, like plausibly contributing to social causes doesn't mean that you'll have to like give up art entirely. It just means that you'll have to spend a little bit less time on it. You know, and then the other world that I'm asked to compare that to is one in which in which once every week like an evil demon kind of shuts off my mind and then like causes me to go around calling people the N-word. And I had to decide, and we just stipulate that no harm will come to me because of this, and I'll never realize that this happened. And I had to sort of ask, like, intuitively, which world would I prefer for myself? And I kind of had the intuition that I would rather have like the amount of time that I spend on art be restricted than like be taken over by an evil demon and caused to say the N-word to a bunch of people. And maybe you have a different intuition.
But modify, like, I feel like the evil demon case, like, you're stacking the deck to really make trouble for my argument. I think the real comparison class would be the case where you give up an hour a day to dedicate time to some social justice cause, right? In the one case. But then in the second case, it would just be anytime somebody came up to you on the street and asked you if you wanted to donate money to a social justice cause, you got to walk past them.
Yeah.
That clearly does not seem like a bad thing. Like, and it seems like what you're assuming is that just by denying that members of other social identities have like can make additional claims on us, that we would have to be committed to thinking that we could mistreat members of those social identity groups, but that assumption is mistaken, I think.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, like, the other route for responding to the argument, like you said, is gonna like give a debunking account of the intuition. But my suspicion is the debunking accounts are probably going to be these kind of semi-plausible just so stories you can tell about our intuitions about well-being. But they're going to be just as plausible as the kind of just so stories that hedonists about well-being and utilitarians give to like think that liberties and rights are especially important, and they're going to be kind of equally strong in applying to like in like debunking the intuition that having liberties and rights is really important, and having freedom to do what you want to do is important. And so I think maybe the way you just recommended is the way to go for you. I'll need to think about it more. Yeah. Okay. So.
Hold on, real quick. We've been talking about this one chapter forever.
I'm going to split this into two parts, so we'll do a color consciousness one.
Okay. Okay. So I guess my response, a different response I could give to your case about the international student who says the N-word. I would say that case misunderstands what I'm trying to achieve. And so I would say that rather than creating this case where this international student like is just saying the N-word to people, we might think, for example, that it's wrong to say slurs to people in general. And so there's a general obligation to not say slurs. And so that would be a way to like account for the fact that it would be wrong for that person to do that, even if we bought into colorblindness as I understand it. And then I would suggest that the case that we should consider is a case where there was like a Black person who was calling on the international student to help them with something. Maybe it was like a call for some kind of reparation or something like that. And the international student just blamelessly did not understand what they were saying and walked away from them.
Yeah.
It seems like that's not bad for the international student. Like in the same way that we could say that it would be bad for the international student to think that they had to give up more time than they actually had to causes that they otherwise would not care about.
I mean, like, would our intuitions about that change if you were just shown 10 documentaries about about the benefits of this charity? Right? It could be that we're not really taking stock of the goodness of the charity, whereas like we are imagining in full vivid detail the case in which the foreign exchange student says the N-word to the Black dormitory.
Yeah, that could be the case. Yeah, interesting. Sorry, these are all really, really interesting questions I haven't encountered.
Yeah, I maybe lost the thread of this. We both need to think about it more. But okay, I'll stop here because I'm gonna make it into a part 2. So I'll just like reintroduce it.